So the pioneering work that Vita Sapien is doing is not only looking at the eco-spirituality aspect, but also trying to be disciplined in the way that we communicate spirituality. And the reason why spirituality, I think, is really important is because it is that thing that drives people to do extraordinary things.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina Valdez, and I'll be your host for the evening. And we have on our show a very special guest. We have Guy Lane, who is a founder of Vita Sapien. So just a brief introduction of Guy. He is an environmental scientist, an author, an entrepreneur. So he conceived in 2016 this idea of a non-theistic spiritual philosophy that he believed was grounded in the needs of the age. This is something that is certainly near and dear to my heart. I know I've spoken about the importance of spirituality, about respect for the planet, about a sense of awe and wonder that is this planet and the fact that we are all here. It's my thought that it's going to be very difficult to move forward in terms of healing the planet, healing humanity and all of the living beings that share this planet without this mind-heart shift. So I'm really, really interested to hear what Guy has to say and to see how our thoughts may be similar in this respect. So I'm going to give it up to Guy. Guy, can you please share with us a bit about yourself and your organization?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Regina. That's a lovely introduction. So in my 20s, I spent a couple of years working in the oil industry, international offshore oil exploration. And that was when I first had this really clear insight that there was something fundamentally wrong in the relationship between humans and the planet. I remember standing on the bow of a ship off the coast of Taiwan and looking at the plastic bags drifting by. This was 30 years ago. And I knew that it was wrong. I mean, it took me maybe 20 years or 15 years to understand why it was wrong. And that's sort of like a distinction that I think is really important. And this is the sort of spiritual component. You know, one of the aspects of spirituality is this sort of sense of right and wrong. What happened was I was doing a master's of business, and in 2015, the Pope Francis wrote the document called the Laudato Si. It's an encyclical, a papal teaching that basically said that it's sinful to destroy the planet. And I thought, great, well, look, there's 1.2 billion Catholics. If they, this is the great transition of the Catholic faith, problem solved, right? We got the foot soldiers, hierarchical organization. If the big boss says that we should stop killing the planet, problems, over for, significant proportion of the problem. But then, of course, a year later, it's sort of, there wasn't really any follow-up to this. And then I realized that it wasn't really possible for an institution like mainstream religion to be able to pivot far or fast enough in order to actually make a meaningful difference in the time that we've got left. And the reason for that is because their founding documents predate the scientific revolution, like the Bible in the case of the Catholic Church. And they've built 2,000 years of practice, which is often hostile to the environment. The conquistadors were accompanied by the Catholics. And so I realized then that this huge chunk of humanity wasn't really able to fully participate in this transition. So I started looking at the New Age spiritual movement to see what was in that. And between the New Age spiritual movement and mainstream religions, which accommodates most people's spiritual views, there's practically nothing of real substance that can help us address the climate and ecological crisis in a really fundamental and directly and clearly spoken way. There are fragmentary references to these things throughout. And what I realized was we needed some sort of a spiritual philosophy that had the word Anthropocene in it, that had the words ocean acidification in it. It needed to be very direct, and it needed to be focused on the best available science and to continually update with the best available science to give us the clearest picture of what we need to do to get out of the mess. And I looked around for that, but I couldn't find it. So I sat down one day, this is on the 18th of August, and I wrote I think about a 2,000-word essay and said, look, what we need is a religion devoted to Gaia. And I looked up the Australian taxation regulations, about how to set up a religion in Australia, which needed a belief in a supernatural and the canons of conduct to give effect to the belief. So I just wrote this into my essay, and then I flipped the essay up onto LinkedIn and then went off and did something else, right? Forgot all about it. But then a couple of days later, I got contacted by a guy that ran a PR company in Malaysia who invited me to Malaysia to speak about this new earth-based religion, which I'd conceived but hadn't actually planned to do anything with. So I had 2 months to prepare for this meeting, and so I just continued to embellish and to work on the idea. And that's been going on since August 2016. What I came to realize early on was that religion wasn't the proper frame of reference. What we were really looking at was a spiritual philosophy. When you talk to most people about religion, if they are religious people, they're only interested to really hear about their religion. And if they're not religious people, then they're not really interested to talk about it. It simply isn't the right frame of reference. So we sort of changed the focus of the work to sort of focus on a spiritual philosophy. And through my master's, I did an independent study unit where I got all this scientific literature around spirituality, a big thick pile of papers. And I went through them. And one thing that was really clear was that even amongst the academic literature, it was very difficult to find anything really substantive to help you understand the subject of spirituality. And so in order for me to be able to effectively communicate what I was going on about, I needed to create some sort of frame of reference. And that's part of the work that I've been doing, is to help create a frame of reference by which people can understand the subject of spirituality, so that then we can talk about how spirituality can be employed as a part of this transition to a sustainable future. And so there's actually a little table in the little blue book that I hand out with 6 key points. So I regard spirituality as an umbrella concept that shelters a whole bunch of themes, and I've selected out the key themes. And so awe, wonder, and amazement is one of those themes you just mentioned. Answers to life's big questions is one of those themes, and so forth. So the pioneering work that Vita Sapien is doing is not only looking at the eco-spirituality aspect, but also trying to be disciplined in the way that we communicate spirituality. And the reason why spirituality, I think, is really important is because it is that thing that drives people to do extraordinary things, right? And some institutions know how to actually use spirituality as a tool for their own ends. For example, I'll give you 2 extreme examples. The born-again Christian movement are absolute masters at having somebody talk to somebody on the street, and within 3 weeks, they're ensconced in a local church, paying 10% of their pre-tax income, reading the Bible, and effectively, through appealing to a spiritual questions, they get people to make radical personal behavioral change. Okay. Another example of that, even more extreme again, and again, the purpose of Vita Sapien is not to do what those people do, right? But another example is how ISIS recruits 20-year-old kids who are only really interested in football and smoking cigarettes, and in the space of 4 months turns them into frontline fighters for the caliphate in 4 months. But by not appealing to their rational mind, appealing to spirituality, appealing to their sense of meaning, appealing to their sense of where they come from and where they are going and where they are now in this grand schema. And so I'm thinking, and so this is the most powerful motivator of human behavior, and it's been overlooked by the environmental movement. There is obviously people involved in eco-spirituality that spread the ideas, but if you actually look at the extent to which that philosophy has penetrated into society, it's really, really, really negligent. And so the idea of Vita Sapien was to try and find the tools by which we could tap into people's spirituality to connect them to the awe and wonder of this living planet, that we could then find the tools by which we could have that spiritual connection then manifest through the actions and inactions, and to basically help people find the wherewithal within them to actually do what is necessary to fix the crisis. Because at the moment, today, the crisis is not being fixed. We're still losing. And so the idea was to try and use spirituality as a tool, if you like, or to understand how spirituality can actually invoke people to stand up and do what's necessary. When we were going through the paperwork for the Charity Commission, we were asked how many Vitans were there, which is a bit unfair because we had only just getting started. So I said, look, the better question is how many could there be? And we use a model called cultural creatives, which says that there are 3 broad psychographics amongst Western people, which is the way that people think. So about half, 55% of the population they call moderns. Modern people basically don't really see a problem in the world. They don't really see climate change as an issue. But then you've got 15% of what they call conservatives, who are sort of harking back to prior times. And then you've got the cultural creatives that make up about 35% of the public. We've said that we think that a quarter of the cultural creatives would take Vita Sapien as their dominant spiritual philosophy if we can get it in front of them in a compelling manner. And that's really the work that I've been doing over the last few years, is to try and understand how to actually explain this, and then also how to actually roll it out and get it in front of people.
I really, really I really resonated, of course, with the idea of awe. I read an article recently that spoke to the importance of this experience to our mental health. And I think another thing that we're seeing in our society is not just a spiritual vacuum, but also a great deal of mental health breakdown due to this disconnection between the natural world. We're just simply not plugged in the way that we are meant to be. And it's causing a great deal of anguish and societal upheaval. I know that Dr. Carter has spoken with you a lot and that you've had prior conversations. And Peter, maybe you could tell us a bit about your work with Vita Sapiens, and if you have any questions or thoughts, I would love to hear what you have to share.
It's been delightful to actually have a few discussions with Guy here, and he mentions his writing of the philosophy and approach, and every time he sort of did a rewrite, it got better. And so keep writing, Guy, because it's really, really important. I was thinking, how many people have I come across in my climate change work who actually see the issue, the problem, as essentially a spiritual, moral, or ethical one? And you're a very rare character in that respect. Although our late great colleague Stuart Scott, of course, he actually did come from that aspect as well. So my first question would be to you, my friend Guy. So what is it, do you think, in your life or in you that makes you so different? The climate change world I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think part of it is that I've actually been able to be very free in my adult life to pursue my whim, if you like. And so I don't have family in Australia. I don't have a mortgage. I don't work a regular job. I've had a lot of time to actually just contemplate and think these things through. I'm half educated. I've got 2 degrees, a master's degree and a bachelor degree. And I'm just followed the logical pathways, but also I've been specifically looking to find something that hadn't been done in the climate and ecological space. I've been looking for something to sort of kind of pioneer. And I stumbled across the spiritual thing quite by chance. And when I started to read into it a little bit more detail and understand how powerful it was as a tool, and how it had been practically ignored almost totally by the environmental movement, it seemed like that was actually the gap analysis. That was the gap. That was something that needed to be filled. And so in my normal fashion, I just jumped in and started to try and figure it out. I think that's the real difference. Like, a lot of other people probably would have come to the same conclusion had they had the time and effort. And also, I've spent a lot of time out in the wilds. I used to have a sailing boat. I used to go sailing, and I've had these few instances with these seabirds called Sulolokagaster, which is the brown booby bird. And I've just kind of find this bond with this bird. And then you sort of understand that I have that spirituality connected to nature, whereas a lot of people might never have actually had that in the first place.
So that brings me, unfortunately, to remember that the world's birds are disappearing very fast, certainly where I live, and it's the same everywhere, apparently. And even insects, of course, as we know, are disappearing fast. And our scientists, our experts, they keep on researching these matters, and they keep on confirming, that, yeah, this is happening. But I think there's a big, big problem in the so-called objectivity of the scientific world, in which they make it a principle that they will not go near anything they call a value judgment or anything that's moral or ethics or anything like that. They'll just stick to their objective numbers. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's science's role, is to be analytical about things. But I guess the question really comes down to the politics of science, which is, what are the things that we actually choose to study? And the other thing as well is that whilst the scientists might be actually analytical themselves in their work, they can be a lot less analytical when they speak outside of work hours, if you know what I'm saying. So there are a lot of scientists who would speak in public about their work and are able to actually conjecture more than they could if they were writing in a science paper. And I think that's really important because that helps to sort of show like a shadow truth to the scientific evidence.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that question, Peter. I think that's one of the things that is missing is scientists are great at scientists, but we need communicators who can communicate what's happening at a deeper level. And I think that's really just crucial. Paul, I was on a panel with you at COP27, spiritual panel, religious panel on various leaders in spiritual thought. I know that you shared from a spiritual but non-religious perspective. And so, yeah, would love to hear from you as well and what questions you have for Guy.
Thank you, everybody. So, yeah, we had an interfaith session at COP27, and we've also had some previous ones at previous COPs. It seems that quite a few people are sort of on board in the different religions to recognizing the climate crisis problem. And I think, there's more communication within their various communities on it, but there's still the question is how do they leverage you get a lot of people thinking the same way, how do you actually get change in our political system with our government? We can't even get our governments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies at the moment. They keep putting more and more money, especially after the COVID crisis, into subsidizing fossil fuels. So not only they're not taking a neutral stance, they're taking a corporate favorite stance, and they're much more worried. What they say is about the economy, putting more money into it. And yet really, by subsidizing fossil fuels, we all know it's shooting ourselves in the foot. Also, there are some scientists that have very strong spiritual beliefs. At the conference on biodiversity, there was a very interesting session moderated by Catherine Hayhoe, for example, and we did a separate interview for the Climate Emergency Forum with her after. And what was interesting is in our conversation, the spiritual aspect never really came up. So I think that, lots of scientists have these strong spiritual beliefs, but for some reason, they think that it's counter to their science message. I don't know. I mean, how do you sort of bring those two worlds together? Because, the scientific methods are clearly not working to address the climate problem. A lot of the problem, I think, is because of the over compartmentalization of scientists, not enough system thinkers. And when you get to system thinkers and then you get to spirituality, there's a lot of connection between that. Spirituality is all about how things are connected all together. We're all in the same boat, we're all in the same system. So can you talk about spirituality a bit from the systems standpoint?
Yeah, so part of what I've been researching over the last few weeks is to try and understand the origins of spirituality in humans in order to try and frame a better framing of what it actually is. And the work that I've been looking at goes back to what they call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, which was in Africa around 80,000 years ago and in Europe about 40,000 years ago. If you look at the tools that were being used by those humans, they were relatively basic. And then pretty much overnight, there was this explosion in tool complexity. And this is where archery, the first evidence of archery came in. This is where the cave painting started to get extremely complicated, where funerary practices started to become a lot more detailed. So that was around 40,000 years ago in Europe. So spirituality seems to be enmeshed in amongst all of those other higher functions of the brain. So the artistic function, but also the rational function, the planning function, the conception of being able to do something now with a result later on. Relatively easy to break a piece of stone to make a sharp stone as a tool. Relatively easy to attach that to the end of a stick to make a spear. Very, very difficult to conceive and build archery equipment, bows and arrows, feathers, and so forth. So all of these things are all kind of tied together. I think that's a part of it, is that you can't really separate spirituality from rationality. And I think like Catherine Hayhoe is a really interesting case study because she's very passionate as a Pentecostalist Christian. She speaks openly about that. And yet there's practically nothing written in Pentecostalism that would actually give her a natural love for the planet, which she obviously has. So I suspect she's what I call a Vitan Christian. So a Christian who has a deep love for the planet. And again, so I think the opportunity for scientists is to, outside of their business hours, is to speak about their love of nature, which would demonstrate their spiritual connection to it.
Thank you for that. I agree that it would be great to have scientists do that. And another thing that you had mentioned, you talked about the creative class. I feel as though I'm confused. Like we're living in a period, we're seeing the end of the world. And I'm wondering, where is Picasso's Guernica? Where is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring? Where are the great artists and thinkers of our time in terms of expressing this in a way that people can relate to, the people who make change? I mean, what are your thoughts about this guy?
I was looking at a Facebook post today, actually, of an African tribe. I just looked at a whole series of photos. I didn't get any context, but these guys the kids were basically doing these absolutely outrageous face paintings, and they're all different colors and all different patterns, and some of them had grasses and hats, and there was an expression of art that blended the individual character into the environment, that if they stood next to a bush, they'd actually disappear within it. So in a way, part of the sort of problem in a way is to sort of look at contemporary art pieces and all of that, like left brain stuff, the way that art can be actually understood as being brilliant because of 10 particular reasons. But there's another type of art, which is where you basically use art to embed yourself into the environment of which you're a part. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer to the question. And also, look, the rate of the decline is so fast that I think it's even amongst the people who are following along, the decline is so fast with the climate here and the ecosystem there, and all the political traumas that are going on and the COVIDization of everything. It's hard for people to actually keep up, to actually know what the hell is actually going on. And I think this is a really important part about Vita's work, is that we've got a frame of reference, like a time frame, that we've got a destination to get to, which we call the verdant age. Others call it ecological civilization. Simply the concept of human civilization acting synergistically with the biosphere. We're developing the tools. We kind of know how to do it, but what we don't know is how to implement it. And this is what Vita's mission is, to try and develop programs that on an individual level, people can actually find awe and wonder in nature. And then through that spiritual revelation to nature, guided by the environmental sciences and observing pointers towards right action, can conceivably create a legion of super empowered individuals that will go out and do what's necessary to fix the mess in the limited time that we've got left. And the only way to do that is for something like Vita Sapien to explode on the planet as fast as possible and properly funded. And I'll give you an example of that, is the way that the oil company BP paid Ogilvy Mayer $100 million to get their creatives to figure out how to have the whole world think that climate change was their fault and not the fault of the oil companies bribing the governments. $100 million campaign, it did it. So if you imagine something like that, call it 100 million to use an argument, a number, a campaign to spread eco-spirituality through the world through programs where people, whether you take them to the forest or whether you take them to an overgrown lot with some sort of a VR or whatever the program is, there's got to be ways. And this is what we want to find the funding for, is to actually develop these awakening programs. And I think everybody's ready for it. The Vita story is designed to blend seamlessly in with whatever your existing spiritual beliefs are.
That's great. If people want to help, or if they have ideas from funding, is there a way that they can reach out to you?
Yeah, so the email is vitaplaneta@gmail.com. Just on the website, it's written on the website. And the funding is, it always seems to be wrong to be talking about money when you're talking about spirituality. But this idea only really exists on a website and a few books and some cards that maybe 50 people in the whole world have actually seen. If this theory that I have, that we can actually use spirituality to motivate extraordinary behavior in people, is to be tested, it needs to be tested properly, and that needs resourcing.
So Guy, you mentioned your website. Could you give us the URL so people can actually find you? And by the way, those of you who are watching, we'll put that in the description, the show notes as well. But Guy, your website address?
It's vitasapien.org. So VITA SAPIEN.org. Vita Sapien broadly translates to life wise. So wise about our personal life, but also wise about our place amongst life on earth. Vitasapien.org.
Oh, thank you so much, Guy. Paul, I'm wondering if you had some other thoughts or questions?
I think attendance for people in mainstream religious groups, if attendance at church is any indication, I think it's down quite a bit across Canada. In fact, some churches are becoming condos or selling off half of their lots and things because they can't get funding. It seems to me like the spirituality and religious thought has been kind of replaced by consumerism, I guess, in my view. Consumerism, buying more stuff, and all that is very bad for the planet. So if we can get back to some sort of spirituality, as you're suggesting, for the earth, that could really sort of make inroads into reducing consumerism. I mean, have you thought about those aspects?
Absolutely. Regina made a point that there was this sort of spiritual void in people. I think that's the wrong phraseology. We're all spiritual creatures, but we just fill that chamber with different things, right? And so most Western people, the moderns in the cultural creative framework, 55% of the public, kind of fill their spiritual vessel with consumerism, with sports, with fishing, with holidays. I mean, you can have a fulfilled life that seems to answer all the world's questions, big questions in life. What are we here for? Oh, to go travel, go and watch the footy. That's a perfectly reasonable answer. But but spirituality expresses itself into the real world through our actions and inactions. It's the motivator of our behavior. And so this is why if we can change spiritual belief, and then behavior naturally follows behind it. And if you can have a transformative, powerful change of spiritual belief, like that, oh my goodness moment, right? When you finally get that we're a part of the ecosystem and it's going, right? That can potentially trigger extraordinary, huge new behaviors in people.
I see parallels between spirituality and like wisdom. Wisdom is very, very different from knowledge or people's beliefs. And, I think, with all of the information available, it tends to, on the web, et cetera, digital media, it tends to make people more shallow in their thinking. There's not as much deep thinking going on. There's not as much wisdom. It's just consuming information and then using that to consume products that have to be made, which then harm, the whole ecosystem.
I mean, I think also that whole notion of consuming, the mental consumption vis-a-vis social media, is just completely distracting people from what's important in the world, not just in their own lives, but in all of our lives. And that's just, it's really so sad, because we're all missing this opportunity to meet this great challenge, and everyone's swiping left or right,
Yeah, and this is the point as well, is that people can believe anything, right? This is the really important point, is that spirituality isn't automatically guided towards the caring for the ecosystem. It's a vessel that gets filled with pretty much anything. So if we can just guide people to believe the right things, then the actions follow. And the way to do that is to have some sort of structure. One of the texts that advises my work with Vita Sapien is called Blue Ocean Strategy. And there's a book that came out of the Singapore University Business School. And they basically looked at these really companies that had really stood out from the crowd. Blue ocean refers to an ocean that isn't saturated with blood from the sharks and competition. It's about organizations or companies that don't have competition. And they basically identified that these companies that stood out had taken standard business models and then made these distinctive and specific changes to them to try and, for example, they look at Cirque du Soleil as an example. The most expensive part of running a circus is the animals and the star performers. So they don't have animals and star performers. And they target their marketing to people that don't go to the circus, because there's a lot more of people that don't go to the circus than people that do go to the circus. So we've tried to take the sort of standard spiritual religious sort of model and use blue ocean thinking on it to find a way to create something which is compelling to people, that doesn't have all of the nasty, horrible dogma, that doesn't have all of the insane beliefs, that doesn't have this sort of doom and gloom and like pressure and somebody's looking over your shoulder and you're going to go to hell. We're trying to create a spiritual philosophy, sort of like the way that Shinto is in Japanese religion, that in Japanese society, that it just is a part of society to see yourself as a part of the ecosystem, just the way that the Cro-Magnon people would have when spirituality first evolved, in this case, in the Europeans.
I really like the idea of encouraging people to see themselves as a part of the ecosystem, because as I had mentioned in the beginning, too many of us are just separate. We're just separate from the planet in which we inhabit. Therein lies so much of the problem. And I really want to thank you so much, Guy, for sharing your wisdom, for sharing Vita Sapiens with us. And I hope that for those of you watching that do want to feel that you're a part of something, that you learned something, you learned about a group that maybe you might be interested in, you can head over to the website. And I hope that you're also interested in Climate Emergency Forum and that you have subscribed. And if you haven't, this would be a great time to do so. And make sure to like and share this video. And if you have any other ideas on how you feel your spiritual life and how you connect with the planet, please share it with us in the comments. It would be great to see your thoughts. And meanwhile, we look forward to seeing you at the next Climate Emergency Forum.